welcome to Beyond the Limits with me, Mike Forsyth.
And me, Matt Clark. Apologies for the gap between episodes of late. I guess we could consider this the kickoff of season 2. The winter bugs have certainly been taking a toll in my household. I'm sure they have been as I'm aware that they have been in your house as well, Mike.
Yeah, the less said about that, the better, I think. But yeah, let's style it out and pretend this is the start of season 2. And today, to honour that fact, we're going to try something slightly different. And that is frame this as a sort of debate. And now, Matt, I don't know about you and your experience of debating, but the last time I did a debate, I was 14 years old and it was at school against a visiting girls' school. And I had to debate that the pen was mightier than the sword. And needless to say, it was a complete disaster. I got very distracted by the presence of these alien creatures that were girls and got completely tongue-tied and lost quite conclusively. So I'm hoping this one's going to be a little bit more successful.
The only debate that happened when I was 14 years old was about whether I get handed over pocket money in exchange for sweets or lunch money, those kind of things. But I'm sure your debating skills are much better than mine, but I'll try and give you a fair run for your money. So today we're talking about salt, aren't we? So I guess the first question is, why are we talking about salt? The reason we're talking about salt today is there's various companies that are promoting these effervescent salt tabs now, these supplements that you just pop in your water to make it taste nice, and along comes with that are all of the various health benefits that they're claiming. There is one particular company that caught our attention called Element, and they have some quite interesting scientific articles that they have self-published, particularly claiming that the World Health Organization is misguided in its recommendations on salt. And obviously that pricked up our ears. So we thought we'd better deep dive into it.
Yeah, so today we're going to try and answer that question. So should we be limiting our salt intake? Or is everything we know about this ubiquitous mineral completely wrong? So, Matt, kick us off. Talk to me about some of these companies and what they are saying.
Yes, so there's numerous. The one I mentioned at the top of the show, Element, seems to be the most common one in the States. This is now sponsoring many health podcasts. There's a few that I've spotted in the UK as well. Fizz, beginning with a PHIZZ. There's another company called 45, which promotes it in my local gym. And I think even on Instagram now, I've been targeted, having researched this, there's another company called Hunter and Gather. Now, these products are essentially fizzy tablets that you drop in your water. They're easy to use, they're easy to produce, they are nice tasting, they've got various sweeteners in them. They also come with various health claims. And one in particular, like I mentioned, has gone all out in the war on the traditional anti-salt beliefs. Element has even got a tagline, "Stay salty." And like I said, it's sponsoring a lot of these podcasts. Now, these all sound wonderful, with a list of ingredients specifically listed to make you feel like, oh gosh, I'm missing amino acids, or I'm missing potassium or magnesium in my diet, and how you can just easily pop this in your water. But I guess what I want to know is, are they actually good for you? Do they cause any problems? Should we all be taking them?
Yeah, this one really shocked me, actually, because I guess through the course of this series that we've been doing on a lot of these health claims, a lot of these medical fads, when you look at their science explanations on their websites, it all tends to be quite fluffy. They don't go into detail. They omit, accepted medical belief, or they omit important research that is contrary to their message. But this is interesting because Element in particular have, as you say, gone on the offensive here. And they have, rather than omit anything, they have published article after article breaking down the WHO and traditional medical thinking on salt intake and explaining point by point why they think that everyone is wrong and they are right. So that's why I found this one very interesting, and looking forward to getting into it. So I'm going to kick us off with some really brief general background about salt and the benefits associated with this. Now, I'll try and keep this as not boring as possible, but essentially we all know about salt. It traditionally makes things tastier and is considered a bit of a food villain, but it is essential, as we say, for many things. So when we look at those, there's fluid balance. So sodium is essential for maintaining the correct balance of fluids, both inside and outside of cells, and that's crucial for overall hydration and proper bodily function. It plays a key role in transmitting nerve signals and enabling muscle contractions and relaxations. It helps in the absorption and transport of nutrients into cells. It's involved in the acid-base balance, and it helps regulate blood pressure.
I just want to chip in there as well with, why we harp on about salt and sodium, and then also in the context of fluid and why that's important in blood pressure, because I guess that's critical to most of this argument, isn't it? Now, our body, by process of homeostasis, which is a fancy word for trying to maintain kind of neutral or try and maintain a balance, monitors the amount of sodium we have in our blood and in our cells by this neurohormonal axis, which is called the renin angiotensin aldosterone axis. And what a mouthful that is. But essentially, the body is trying to keep tight control on how much sodium we have in our body. There's an important point I need to maybe dwell on here. And you talked about fluid balance, and I think it's worth just explaining how that works. And I want to take you now, and I'm aware that my awful analogy hit rate's quite high with you, Mike, but bear with me here.
Does it involve zombies?
It doesn't involve zombies, this one, but it does involve Ryanair or American Airlines or Qantas, name your airline of choice. But when you're at the gate and you have to show your passport to go through to like this second section, which is normally a room, this idea that you've got a load of people kept on one side of the gate, and when they go through to the other side of the gate, if it's really busy, everyone feels like they need more space, don't they? And if you take in more salt or more sodium, if you've got it in a confined space, it's crying out for dilution. The body wants it to be diluted. It kind of needs more space. And the body has these processes of moving people backwards and forwards between this kind of passport checkout. The body's actively trying to control how many people are on each side of the gate to control the balance of space and how many people are in that space. And that's the same with sodium and water. If you put a load of salt in and put a load of sodium into your body, if it gets absorbed, you all of a sudden become incredibly thirsty, and that's your body crying out for more water or more dilution of all of that salt. Now, to do that, the kidney has this hormonal axis to control that. The kidney is filtering approximately 180 litres of your plasma in a day, and that is containing about 25,000 milliequivalent of sodium. But remarkably, only 100 to 250 milliequivalent is typically excreted in the urine. So that's filtering a lot of your blood, and you only really lose a little bit of sodium, meaning that about 99% of it is reabsorbed. And I think that's important to bear in mind, given the balance of sodium, how much we're taking in our diet, and how we go about losing sodium by means of sweating and those other mechanisms, for example.
Yeah, I think important to bear in mind, and I'm glad that you covered that bit, because I'm not sure that my brain would be able to deal with that at all. Now, let's get into the crux of this, and we'll start this debate. So I think I've got the easy job here, because I am going to argue that NICE and the WHO and pretty much every medical organisation in their argument about salt are right. And I can fall back on a lot of evidence and a lot of guidance, but let's give it a go. So, Your Honour, let me put my case forward. Salt, as I've touched upon already, we know it's an essential component of the human diet, but excessive intake is a major contributor to hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So high blood pressure is the primary cause of death and disability in adults worldwide. It's responsible for up to 62% of strokes and 49% of coronary heart disease. So that's just worth bearing in mind, because they are staggering numbers. And we know, or we think, that excessive sodium consumption plays a significant role in this development. So you've touched a little bit on the physiological impact of excess sodium. As you say, the kidneys regulate that blood pressure by filtering sodium and maintaining fluid balance. But when sodium intake exceeds the body's capacity to excrete it efficiently, we have an increase in water retention, and that leads to elevated blood pressure. So we know that excess sodium stimulates the release of hormones such as angiotensin 2 and aldosterone, and that can cause vasoconstriction, so constriction of the vessels, further fluid retention, and this can exacerbate hypertension. So, as I said, I've got a lot of evidence to fall back on with this. There are multiple lines of research. So this is epidemiological, genetic and migration studies, as well as population-based interventions and randomized controlled trials. And they have consistently demonstrated a direct correlation between high salt intake and increased blood pressure. So the meta-analyses of these clinical trials confirm that reducing sodium intake results in significant reductions in blood pressure. And this is across diverse populations, including, interestingly, individuals with and without high blood pressure. The one I want to talk about specifically is called the DASH sodium studies. And this was a key investigation into dietary approaches of managing high blood pressure. So what that showed was it demonstrated that reducing sodium intake leads to measurable blood pressure reductions. Combining sodium reductions with a DASH diet, so that's one rich in fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy, provides an even greater benefit. So there are some studies really of very good quality that have consistently showed this relationship. On top of this, I think if you were to, say, line up a group of doctors and ask each of them one by one their thoughts about their relationship between salt and blood pressure, these are the studies they'd tell you about. And actually, one thing we haven't mentioned so far is how much of an issue salt intake is. So over 3/4 of dietary sodium comes from processed foods rather than us sprinkling salt on our meals, this discretionary salt use. This includes hidden sources such as preservatives, sauces, additives like your monosodium glutamate and alike. So how much salt should we be having? So the WHO recommends a daily intake of less than 5 grams of salt. And that specifically is to mitigate the risks associated with the hypertension. Now, that's not a lot. That's like a level teaspoon of salt. So as I've touched upon already, salt is in so many of our meals. It's hidden in the processed foods. I talk to patients about this a lot. I say, look, we need to cut down on your salt. And they say, oh, I don't add salt to anything. Really, that's kind of slightly missing the point. Salt is in everything. We need to be looking actually at our specific meals that we're eating, reading nutrition labels, and essentially opting for fresh, minimally processed ingredients as much as possible. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will rest my case. No one is arguing that sodium isn't essential for physiological function, but excessive intake poses, I think, significant health risks. I'm really interested to hear your counter-argument to this. But my view, at this point at least, is that these companies that are promoting the benefits of salt by taking some unproven evidence or conflating this to sell their product, at best it's cheeky, at worst I think it's irresponsible. And on that, I reiterate that this House believes that the pen is mightier than the sword, and excess salt, whether in the form of supplements or dietary intake, is to be avoided. Now, Matthew, come back to me.
Okay, well, as I stand on the other side of the playground, I must acknowledge you've made some pretty good points there, and look, I'm going to struggle to take the other side of the argument here because I feel like my traditional medical training has veered me onto your side of the playground. But look, I'm just going to go through. This is one of the articles that Element has written. It does actually just make some quite interesting points, and you've made a lot of good points about how salt is directly correlated with higher blood pressure. And I guess my understanding of that was salt is really bad, and that actually we all just need to avoid salt, and that you need to really minimize how much salt you take in. And I don't know if that's because, like you said, salt is in everything, and it's in all of these processed foods, and it's almost as a warning of just avoid putting extra salt in your food because it's ubiquitous and we're surrounded by it. But I'm just going to walk you through this article, and I'm just going to raise some of the key points because I think there's some interesting stuff here. So Element have got this claim on, header of their website is that more salt, not less. And I quote, it says, a growing body of research reveals that optimal health outcomes occur at sodium levels 2 to 3 times government recommendations. That's why we say more salt, not less. Now, obviously, I've got problems with that already, that this is not a one glove fits all. Like, not everyone should be having more salt, not less. And actually, I think it's irresponsible of them to make such a claim. But they do make some interesting points in this article. So I'll start off here. The WHO's claims supporting data and board sweeping recommendations are irresponsible, dangerous even. For starters, their limit is way too low. This idea of 2 grams of sodium per day being way too low, and that would cause headaches, muscle cramps, brain fog for just about anybody with a moderate workout regime. And I actually kind of agree with this to a certain extent, because the research I've looked at of how much salt we lose when we sweat. So a typical hour of rigorous and intensive exercise where you're sweating, you will lose up to about 1.2 grams of salt just in that hour of exercise. Now, anyone who's doing that, who's taking on 2 grams or less of salt per day, is going to run into real problems. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think again, it's potentially they're taking a situation where someone is pushing their body to out of the norm, albeit lots of us exercise vigorously, but it's taking the body out of the norm. And in those situations, we do need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of electrolyte intake, making sure that we are not salt deficient, I guess. But I think to conflate that to more global feelings, is perhaps a little bit of a push.
Yeah, true. Now, I'll move us on. The next point that I thought was interesting in this is that they mention how the model is skewed towards those with high blood pressure. Now, we're talking specifically about the WHO model, and they've reviewed the evidence that the WHO has amalgamated for their argument, and they've highlighted that 65 studies were exclusively done on hypertensive, so those people with pre-existing high blood pressure, whereas 11 of the studies were exclusively done on normotensive, so those people with normal blood pressure. And I think they make a fair point that actually, if you're casting aspersions for society based on data and research that's done purely on those with high blood pressure, although high blood pressure is really common, that isn't a reflective cohort of the broader society. And actually, people with high blood pressure may process salt differently to those who don't have high blood pressure, and that it might be a fundamental genetic problem.
I think with any medical guidance, you need to be careful about giving broad strokes that cover everyone. We know that everybody's different. And I think probably what this is alluding to is this theory of people being salt sensitive or salt resistant. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So I think there is a feeling that perhaps, whilst we know that increased salt intake is a huge risk factor for increased blood pressure, not everyone experiences a blood pressure increase from salt intake. The quoted stats are about 30 to 50% of people are considered salt sensitive, so they're more likely to experience a higher blood pressure from salt, whereas others, those so-called salt resistant, show little or no effect. So I guess, look, there may be a subset of people where increasing salt does not significantly raise your blood pressure. But what I would say is, how do you know which subsection you are in? Are you going to take the risk where you're going to say, look, I don't care about my salt intake. In fact, I'm going to take a supplement because I want to optimize my health outcomes, to use their wordage, and then find that you're running into problems further down the line.
Yeah, I totally agree. Good point. Another point that I'd raise on this is that they're trying to make this slightly binary, in that there's some people that are salt sensitive, for example, whereas there's some people who are fine taking loads of salt. There's no acknowledgement here of the spectrum in between, and how actually, say, if you had a high salt diet for 10 years, you then might not end up in being in this salt sensitive category. This may be a progressive process that actually causes problems down the line. So I think creating this binary argument of people being salt sensitive or not, I don't think stands true either. They do make another interesting point here about sodium intake data being unreliable, and they acknowledge that the authors admit there is no comprehensive reporting of population sodium intake, and that much of this data comes notoriously from unreliable dietary surveys. And I guess we've talked about this before, haven't we? The accuracy of data collection, and no one's going to sit down and measure out exactly how much salt they're taking in their diet with every meal, are they? And it is quite a difficult thing to actually study. A lot of these studies do look at how much salt is excreted, so how much urinary sodium you produce in 24 hours, for example. But again, there's inherent problems with that in how people process salt and how they process it differently. But I thought that was a fair point to acknowledge that actually some of the data is difficult to collect. They then move on to talking about, this is the real juicy bit, talking about, is salt bad for blood pressure? Now, you gave a really nice account of all of the big studies that people, doctors and clinicians reference when we're talking about why salt is bad for you. You mentioned the DASH study. There are some pretty big studies here, and they have put in their article about the InterSalt study from 1988, which found, in capital letters, zero correlation between salt consumption and high blood pressure in 10,000 people across 48 global populations. Now, that's quite an impressive statement, but I actually looked into this study to find out, why do I not know about this? And they have cherry-picked a little bit the words here, saying that there's zero correlation between salt consumption and high blood pressure, because actually there was a correlation found between salt consumption and blood pressure being risen, but not actually being high. So I guess it's how you define high blood pressure or hypertension. But they did find a correlation between that. So I think they've actually cherry-picked that a little bit here to their fault. It was also done on relatively young people as well. So I guess this does come back to who is salt causing problems to, or who does it manifest with problems? And we know that it is probably more the elderly, but is there a continuous spectrum between the young and the elderly? That's the point. Another point for debate. They then also talk about another big study, which is the Cochrane Collaboration Review of 2020, and they talk about it showing a measly reduction in people's blood pressure when they restricted their salt diet, and this was about 4 milligrams of mercury. So yeah, it is quite a small reduction, but again, certainly there is a cause and effect or a link there. Now, this is where it does get interesting though, Mike. This is where I will stand up at the witness box and make an interesting challenge. And this is about this notion of the low salt paradox, because there's a few pretty good studies in 2011, 2014, looking at quite big cohorts of patients, showing that those with quite a low salt diet actually running into problems and actually having a higher blood pressure. Now, there's a theory as to why this might be, and going back to how our understanding of how the kidneys regulate salt and how that impacts the fluid status and how that impacts your water retention, there is this idea that if your salt level is really low, this actually sends signals back to your brain saying, hang on, we need to hold on to more salt. And then your body then starts holding on to more and more fluid almost inappropriately, and how that could, in theory, raise your blood pressure. And particularly a meta-analysis found that actually mortality and cardiovascular events were higher in folks consuming less than 2.6 grams of sodium per day versus intakes of 2.6 to 5 grams per day. Now, I thought that was quite compelling.
Yeah, I think I came across that as well in my research, particularly in terms of this theory of optimal salt intake being somewhat of a bell-shaped curve, by which clearly those who are taking on huge amounts of salt are going to run into problems, but equally there was a situation there where cutting out salt entirely is also not going to be optimal. So again, that perhaps would be in case of the function of salt that we discussed at the beginning, but also with blood pressure as well.
So the last point that I want to raise from this article, which I thought was interesting, and you've touched on this a bit, that they believe that salt isn't necessarily the villain, and that actually the modern diet is problematic because of its sugar content and because of its hyperpalatability, and that actually salt might not be the problem at all. I think you've quite nicely outlined why salt is a problem and why, if left unchecked, certainly will cause problems. But I think they make a fair point here that actually, if you were to look at the modern diet, it's not necessarily just the salt content in the processed foods that we eat that causes all the problems. I will move us on finally, because I've got one other point that I think is interesting but isn't raised by this article, is this notion of orthostatic hypotension. So what that means is when you stand up, you feel a bit dizzy and you take a few seconds for your brain to recover. We've probably all experienced that to a certain extent when we've been a bit dehydrated and we stand up from a chair too quickly. There is a growing body of evidence now suggesting that orthostatic hypertension, particularly if frequent, is actually associated with some poor outcomes in terms of cardiovascular disease and also things like dementia. Now, I'm not going to go and start chugging a load of element salt tabs and say that we should all be drinking more salt because of the ensuing risk of dementia from orthostatic hypertension. But I guess there is, in theory, there is a link here between suboptimal hydration and some longer term health problems.
I think all of those are points to bear in mind. I mean, as I alluded to, you've again drawn the short straw with this, and I think had the harder job because you're arguing against accepted medical practice. But what I wanted to ask you was, I mean, after doing this research, did this change your opinion at all? Did you find yourself questioning what you've been telling patients, or were you able to find the holes in this that we've already kind of alluded to?
I wouldn't say this has necessarily changed my practice, and I'm certainly not going to go and recommend that everyone should be having 3 salt tabs a day because it's an underappreciated mineral. I think what I've acknowledged from this research is that maybe salt isn't the villain that I thought it was, and that it shouldn't be avoided at all costs. It is an essential mineral, and certainly I think problems can happen when we're low in these minerals. And athletes who are exercising on a regular basis certainly need to be aware of replacing this. I think most people do know that, but that is an important message.
I think you're right, and I think at the risk of sounding like a scratch record, we say this in pretty much every podcast, but there's nuance here, right? And it isn't probably a one size fits all. But the issue I take with these companies is, fair enough, if you're writing a blog post or you're writing an article and you say, oh, look, maybe everything we know about low salt intake isn't correct. Maybe we do need to be careful that we're not restricting salt entirely because that might cause adverse outcomes. What I'm surprised about is it's very different when you get someone who is actively promoting a salt supplement here. So, yes, they're saying, oh, you must not avoid no salt, but we know that modern day diets, there's a lot of salt around there anyway. So, what I find strange is that they are promoting this with this woolly phrase of optimizing health outcomes or whatever the hell that means. And I find that slightly irresponsible, if I'm honest. Notwithstanding the fairly reasonable points that they make in their kind of deep dive blogs into salt intake.
Absolutely. I would just like to rip a few more holes in some of these companies before we depart, because I think it's important to do so.
Please do. I'm looking forward to it.
Researching these again, so poor old Fizz. Fizz is, I think, is a UK-based company, but it looks like it was founded by some marketing guys who are certainly not physicians or biomedics. And they've got some claims on there, things like it being hypotonic and how it helps your body hydrate 3 times faster than water alone. Now, this is just, again, marketing nonsense, but hydrating 3 times faster than water alone, I don't know like the statistics they've got for that. I'd love for them to show me. And the studies that I've looked at, I found that while exercising, comparing water to hypotonic sports drinks, so those are just the ones with less concentrated sugars in and things like that, like Fizz contains, at 50 minutes, there was negligible difference. At 150 minutes of vigorous exercise, there was a mild improvement with a hypotonic solution. But, who exercises for 150 minutes? I think they're misleading by saying that this is faster hydration and also 3 times faster hydration than water. I don't think anyone actually really needs that in their life when they're just sat at their desk. Another claim from Element was about this stevia. So stevia is to quote them, they say it contains a natural stevia leaf extract. And this is again from Rob Wolf, one of the authors who publishes these articles, and they go on to claim how stevia actually reduces the intake of calories in test subjects. So this is essentially a sweetener, and they've called it a natural stevia leaf extract to make it sound really organic and benign. Now, this study that they reference was done on a handful of people, and it measured their caloric intake at 15 minutes and 30 minutes after taking a sweetened beverage. But this is, again, short-sighted and misleading, because a lot of the research, and a huge body of research I'm aware of, shows that people who have sweetened products rather than sugar-containing foods or drinks then go on to have this huge insulin spike, which, if you were to measure them over a much longer period, causes them to eat hugely more significant amounts of calories. Now, there's an interesting study that I looked at many years ago about mice drinking Diet Coke versus water with an endless supply of food. And those mice that were allowed to drink Diet Coke instead of water became morbidly obese over several months because they just had continuous appetite. So again, I think that's really misleading. They even then claim that stevia, it may actually be helpful in causing weight loss. And then conveniently they've put, this hasn't been proven yet. And again, this is misleading and short-sighted. So I'm going to stop ranting there, Mike, but let's wrap this up then. I feel like you've won the argument on the salt debate, but give me your thoughts, give me your context.
I think my reflections on this is a couple of things. When I had a look at some of the studies they referenced on the website, I was quite struck by the fact there was a little bit of evidence here that what they were saying wasn't entirely pseudoscience. Particularly, I think the point that they make that is very valid is about the fact that, yes, everyone harps on about salt and how bad salt is, but we're probably forgetting about other things too. So as much as we tell our patients to stop eating salt, they can cut out salt all they want. If they're still eating processed food that's got high levels of sweeteners or sugars in, we're probably still going to be in the same issue. So I think there's a valid point to be made there. I think they're right. Probably not everyone is going to see a blood pressure spike with high levels of salt. But I think to promote the fact that actually we're looking at this the wrong way around and we should all be supplementing with salt, and that just because high salt intake doesn't cause high blood pressure in everyone, then it's all fine. I think that's where it falls down for me. And yes, I think it's made me think about this a little bit more, but I'm certainly not going to be throwing a load of salt tablets into my water anytime soon.
Couldn't agree more. And actually, I think you've just covered all the points that I wanted to make. So well done, Mike.
Thanks, that's a rarity. But yeah, enjoyed that. Thanks, Matt. And we will see you next time.